to go with a very special episode or two here at History She Wrote. You see, we have some awesome kids going in and out of our studios, and they often get caught up in whatever we're putting together at the moment. And these kids are good sports about it all. They end up acting in our documentaries, lending their names to our podcasts, explaining newfangled technology, and getting dragged along to the most ridiculously obscure and esoteric places where history actually happened. So we thought it might be nice to let them ask the questions for once. So here are the kids of From Sarajevo to Red Africa and the things they wonder about in history.
Hello, Auntie Ruthie. It's Joey and Paul, and we've got some questions for you that this one in particular wants to ask. Could you please answer them for us? Right, Paul?
Yes.
No.
What was the first movie that ever existed?
Well, what was the first movie that ever existed?
Oh, hey, my nephews! Such awesome guys and super interested in all the goings on of producing history documentaries. And that is a great question. It is going to take a bit longer answer though, so I hope you don't mind Auntie Ruthie doing a bit of droning on. People have told stories since the dawn of spoken language, but the development of cinema, of movies, was a leap forward, unlike anything since the invention of writing. Cinema makes stories come alive and it immerses us in them, no matter what language we speak. The first sort of movie was actually a series of photographs taken by a guy named Edward Muybridge. They were of a trotting horse in 1878. Muybridge, who was hired to do this by none other than Leland Stanford, the founder of the university, set up a series of cameras on tripwires that would go off in sequence as the horse trotted by. The result could be watched rather like one of those spinning things that simulates motion, a fidget spinner, or in a more manual description, kind of like a flip book. Quite a lot was learned about how motion actually occurred, things which had even escaped the most observant naked eye in the past. Muybridge would go on to do several other such stories, which incidentally involved people doing regular things while naked. As an example of how even taking photographs of trotting horses could be fraught with issues, the whole project was actually delayed a few years as Muybridge underwent trial for murdering his wife's lover. The jury decided they probably would have murdered her lover too, in all honesty, and he was freed to go take more pictures of Leland Stanford's horses and naked people. The end of the 1800s was full of cinematic development. Within a decade, cameras had evolved enough so that instead of setting up lots of cameras with tripwires, one camera could record an ongoing set of photos, which could then be watched as a sort of herky-jerky stop motion in real life. In 1888, Louis Le Prince recorded his family walking around their garden in a brilliantly titled sequence called Round Hay Garden Scene. Here again, the drama of Hollywood off screen was foreshadowed because 2 years later, Le Prince disappeared after boarding a train. Neither he nor his luggage were ever found, and conspiracy theories abound as to his fate, with many people convinced that Thomas Edison himself probably had something to do with the whole thing. At the end of 1895, the Lumiere brothers began exhibiting their films in Paris, and several other places. They portrayed such fascinating moments as workers leaving off at the factory, and people were absolutely enchanted with seeing something that wasn't right in front of them. It was an absolute wonder. One person inspired by these films was a woman named Alice Guy, who had been hired as a secretary at a camera company. She saw the real world portrayed by the Lumières and realized that stories could be presented this way as well. In 1896, her first iteration was presented. In this story, a woman basically finds her baby under a cabbage in a field. Alice Guy would go on to direct over 1,000 films and was the first woman to own her own studio. From 1896 to 1906, she was also likely the only female movie director. Sadly, for several decades, she was all but forgotten by the industry, even though she was one of the industry's founders. Around the turn of the century, movies began to be filmed with more than one camera, groundbreaking, which allowed cutting and splicing between different scenes in different places. New techniques and tricks began to make their way on screen, which allowed audiences to immerse themselves more and more into stories, along with new scripts and new ideas that entertained even more. Le Voyage dans la Lune was the first sci-fi movie, and The Great Train Robbery in 1903, the first Western. Genre had been born. I know you asked about the first movie, Paul, but as with almost any question in history, the answer is always it depends. And first is not always a simple concept. Sometimes it's more like asking whether the chicken or the egg came first. And by the way, I do have my opinions on that as well if anyone wants to ask later on.
Hello, my name is Nicola. I'm 9 years old. I would like to ask you, do you believe in fairy tales?
Nicola, I love this question. There are two answers here, though. First of all, yes, I absolutely believe in fairy tales. I think it's nice to think that if we play our cards right, we might actually have a happily ever after. But second, fairy tales are stories about how people understood things in the past. They may not have had all the scientific information we do to explain things, or they may have needed to emphasize why certain rules in their culture existed. But whichever reason brought a particular story into being, it was based on something real. We have a perfect example of that in the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Just as a reminder, the Pied Piper story tells us about the town of Hamelin in Germany, which had a problem with rats. So they hired a rat catcher to get rid of the furry little beasts. The rat catcher played his flute, and the rats all followed him out of town to one or another of a really terrible fate, depending upon which version you hear. All of this seemed much too easily done to the townspeople, who felt that they agreed to pay to get rid of their rats, and this was obviously too much for a job so easily done. So the townspeople refused to pay, and the rat catcher, the Pied Piper, took his payment anyway by leading away the town's children. But did you know that there is really a town called Hamelin in Germany? And this town really does record a historic incident in 1284 when 130 children were led away and disappeared. The town records appear long before the fairy tale did. In 1384, there's a reference to the event, "It is 100 years since our children left." Even the town gate, built in the 1500s, references back to the disappearance of the children. It was obviously a traumatic event. But the thing is, we don't really know how the children disappeared. Of course, we have theories. One theory, according to many historians, and the most likely one, is that the town youth followed a recruiter who was bringing people to settle in more eastern areas of Europe. An economic depression at the time may have made a large number of young people game to try something new, as has happened over and over in history. And in fact, names from Hamelin did begin to appear in the town records of places outside Berlin at around this same time. All in all, that's a much nicer explanation than most of the others, which tend to have horrible endings. For instance, the idea that the children went off on a children's crusade, which actually took place much earlier in the 1200s, would mean that the fate of Hamelin's children was likely either death or slavery. Then there's the thought that the children died of plague, but the exact date of the incident given in history sources makes it about 50 years too early for the plague. Another thought is the possibility of an outbreak of the dancing plague, which was known to have struck a town near Hamelin, and which did cause many young people to drop dead of exhaustion. Perhaps the most horrifying explanation, one which coincides very much with the film Midsummer, claims that the children were led away and sacrificed in a pagan ritual. This is also probably the least likely explanation, as by that time Christianity was well and truly established in Germany, even with an undercurrent of paganism still remaining in syncretic form. And honestly, if 130 children had been sacrificed all at once to a pagan ritual, someone in the church would probably have said something somewhere at some point about it. I mean, they held a whole crusade into Bosnia for far less. We'll be heading into our summer book club, this time focusing on Mata Hari in just a few weeks. But in the meantime, join us again next week as we finish up the questions of the From Sarajevo to Red Africa kids.
What to do?